Chapter 22, Gas Exchange. In this chapter, we're going to look at how different organisms are able to take in oxygen and get rid of carbon dioxide. In other words, we're going to look at the variations on how different types of animals breathe. Then we're going to spend most of the time looking at the structures and functioning of the human respiratory system. And we're going to take a brief glimpse into the physiology and chemistry of gas exchange inside the human body. First things first, mechanisms of gas exchange. As we learned earlier in the semester about cellular respiration, that's the process that takes place in your cells that produces ATP by taking the energy from food molecules and converting it into such ATP. Well, a byproduct of cellular respiration is carbon dioxide. And in obligate aerobes, oxygen is necessary to produce enough ATP to make life possible. So for respiration on a cellular basis, the actual production of ATP requires oxygen, unless you're a bacteria cell. And you have to get rid of the carbon dioxide because that's a toxic byproduct, by the way. So there's a process of gas exchange taking place with the respiratory and circulatory systems working together to supply that needed oxygen to every cell of your body, and then picking up the carbon dioxide and transporting it back to the lungs, the respiratory system, so it can be gotten rid of and replaced with more oxygen. All right. So in animals with lungs, including people, there are three distinct phases of gas exchange. Number one is breathing, when we take air in and breathe it out. When we breathe in, inside our lungs, carbon dioxide leaves our blood and oxygen from the air goes into the blood. Then when we exhale, we're getting rid of it. We're pushing the carbon dioxide out. So, breathing, the exchange of oxygen and CO2 between the respiratory and the circulatory system takes place in the lungs. And then your blood, as it's pumped through the blood vessels, this oxygen-rich blood is being pushed through all parts of the body. And there, exchanges between body cells and the blood, oxygen is taken up, carbon dioxide is taken up by the blood, but the cells take up the oxygen and give back the CO2. So, looks like this, taking air inside and out, breathing in oxygen, exhaling CO2, breathing. Okay, the circulatory system consists of the heart, the blood vessels, and the blood. Alright, inside the lungs, exchanges take place between the circulatory and the respiratory system, specifically the lungs and the blood. Now those gases are transported by the blood, and then in the capillaries there are exchanges of the two gases with the cells. Alright, now animals exchange respiratory gases across moist surfaces. So the part of the animal's body where this takes place is called the respiratory surface. The characteristics of respiratory surfaces are they're thin and moist. That allows oxygen to diffuse across easily enough and carbon dioxide to do the same. So oxygen can diffuse rapidly into the circulatory system or into cells. And carbon dioxide diffuses out at the same clip, same rate. Alright. In some smaller animals like earthworms, the skin is the respiratory surface. Now they're small enough. The skin suits them. They don't need gills because they're small enough. Now, most other animals have specialized body parts. Fish, for example, have gills. Also, aquatic crustaceans. Insects don't have lungs, but they do have tracheal systems, which is a system of tubes that permeate throughout the body and allow gas exchange to take place. But terrestrial vertebrates are more complex animals, so they need more complex structures such as lungs. And animals have ways to keep the ventilation, improve on it, and make sure there's a constant exchange of respiratory gases at all times. Now, respiratory structures such as gills, lungs, and tracheal systems are very highly branched. And this is an adaptation to increase surface area to have an adequate surface to volume ratio. In other words, you take in enough oxygen to support that organism. Gills are an extension for water. Tracheal system is an adaptation for insects on land. And vertebrates have some type, for the most part, except for fish, of course, terrestrial vertebrates have lungs. Now, for aquatic organisms, gas exchange with the water, oxygen is a limiting factor because oxygen does not dissolve very well in water. On the other hand, carbon dioxide diffuses readily into water. Water can only hold about 3% of its volume can hold oxygen. Cold water holds more than warm water, and fresh water holds more than salt water. Now, fish have an adaptation that promotes taking in enough oxygen and getting rid of the carbon dioxide between the water and lungs. And this gas exchange is a counter current exchange. So the transfer between two fluids, in this case water and blood, occurs in opposite directions. All right, when the water goes in through the mouth, then out through the gills. As the water passes one way, the gas exchange takes place in the opposite direction. All right, so the water flows this way, okay? So as the blood flows the other way. So it's countercurrent. The water is flowing, the blood flows in the opposite direction, as you can see here. So as oxygen-rich water passes through the gills, oxygen-poor water leaves the gills. At the same time, oxygen-poor blood is coming from the heart towards the oxygen-rich water. So this is what we call a countercurrent gas exchange. It speeds up the process of getting the oxygen in there and getting rid of the carbon dioxide. That's the significance here. There's another picture here. All right, the water is going this way across the gills. The blood is flowing the opposite direction, countercurrent. And as the blood moves through here, it picks up more and more oxygen. At the same time, the water is losing oxygen. All right, so again, here's the gills. The gills have numerous infoldings, an adaptation to increase surface area. All right, as the water goes this way, the blood flows this way. So as the blood flows this way, it's picking up more oxygen and getting rid of the carbon dioxide at the same time, because the more oxygen it picks up, pushes the carbon dioxide at the same time out. All right. Air breathers have an advantage. Air contains, number one, it's a bigger supply of oxygen, about 21%. And air is lighter, it's less dense, and it's easier to move than water is. So two advantages right there. But with advantages come disadvantage. Number one is keeping the respiratory surface moist, because water evaporates more easily in dry air. All right. As I said earlier, respiratory structures such as gills, lungs, and tracheal systems are branched, very highly branched. And with the insect tracheal tubes, there's branches, and this cuts down, all these branches cut down on water loss, keeping the surfaces moist. And also delivers air directly to the cells. So there is no cell that's very far away from a tracheal tube or a branch of the tracheal tube. Now, insects do have a circulatory system, but it's not involved in gas exchange, simply in nutrient and waste exchanges with the cells. So there are sphericals. These are the openings on the body wall, leading to air sacs and tubes with increased branching. The smaller tubes are called tracheoles. And they look something like that in the microscope. This is the tracheal system of a grasshopper, for example. That's what it looks like. Now, for tiny insects, very small insects, these little tubes bring in enough oxygen and get rid of the carbon dioxide quite well. So their cellular respiration is not compromised by lack of oxygen. Now, larger insects have ways to ventilate, have features to ventilate those tracheal systems, push air in and push air out by moving the body. As the body twists and turns and compresses, relaxes, pushes air in and out, kind of like a bellows. And also flight muscles also harness some of the power from the flight muscles to push air in and out. And here we have a grasshopper in flight. Now, the evolution of lungs is what facilitated tetrapods making their way onto land and successfully colonizing land. It seemed that, based on from what we know from the fossils, tetrapods evolved in shallow water. There are fossils of fish with legs and had lungs and gills, had both. As a matter of fact, there's a salamander called a mud puppy that also has both structures. So perhaps legs enable them to push their heads up out of the water so they can breathe. Now, there's a fossil, Tiktaalik, which lived about 375 million years ago during the Carboniferous period, and it had these adaptations. From the fossil, the eyes were on top of the flat skull, fins. Now, this is a cast of that original fossil. Well, tetrapods evolved into three lines: the amphibians, which have lungs but still use their skin as a respiratory surface; non-bird reptiles, like lizards and snakes, they have low metabolic rates and simpler lungs; but birds and mammals, which came from a third lineage, have higher metabolism, while flight and thinking uses brain power, energy, and more complex lungs. Great deal more respiratory branching and folding inside the lungs, increased surface area. Okay, the human respiratory system. In the human body, or in a vertebrate body, the muscle called the diaphragm separates the chest cavity from the abdominal cavity. and the diaphragm plays a part in ventilation. In mammals, specifically, air is inhaled through nostrils into the nasal cavity where it's filtered and warmed and humidified. From the nasal cavity to the pharynx, that's your throat, to the larynx, which holds your vocal cords, into the trachea, your windpipe. The trachea has two branches, bronchi, bronchus singular, and each bronchus splits into secondary, tertiary, and smaller tracheoles. And finally, to the alveoli. These are grape-like clusters of air sacs. Think of a bunch of grapes, and each air sac is an alveolus. Each grape is an alveolus. So, and it is here in the alveoli where gas exchange takes place. Alright, a quick lesson on human anatomy as far as the respiratory system goes. The nasal nostrils, nasal cavity, inside your skull, above your mouth, where the air is filtered, moistened, humidified, then to the pharynx, that's your throat. Now at the bottom of the pharynx is two openings. One leads to the esophagus, the other openings called the glottis. And the glottis is covered by a flap of cartilage called the epiglottis. Glottis is the opening to the larynx. Inside the larynx are the vocal cords. At the base of the larynx is the trachea, or windpipe. Now, the trachea branches, two branches, one to each lung. Each branch is a bronchus, plural bronchi. Each bronchus splits into bronchioles, which split into smaller bronchioles and finally terminate into an cluster of alveoli. Alright, inside there's a network of special blood vessels called pulmonary circulation from the heart, pulmonary arteries, one to each lung, carry oxygen poor blood. Oxygen poor blood goes through pulmonary arterioles, then finally to the pulmonary capillaries, which surround each alveolus. Air comes inside. Oxygen from the air diffuses into the blood, and pulmonary venules leave each alveolus or cluster of alveoli eventually to pulmonary veins, two from each lung carrying oxygen-rich blood back to the heart. So, alveoli are covered with numerous pulmonary capillaries, and oxygen diffuses into the blood at the same time carbon dioxide diffuses out. Because remember, oxygen will go from a high concentration to a low concentration. Carbon dioxide does the same thing. Now, inside your lungs are specialized cells that produce surfactants. These are wetting agents. It keeps the respiratory surfaces from sticking together, keeps the alveoli from collapsing. Now, there's an issue with babies born prematurely. Their lungs are not fully developed. They don't produce the surfactant. But they have ways to squirt some of that surfactant in there, and artificial surfactant, which keeps the babies breathing until their lungs start producing surfactant. Then they can breathe on their own. And smoking. Well, I think the evidence is conclusive. If you smoke and don't plan on quitting, plan on dying before your time. Smoking killed both my parents. I even smoked. I quit. I got smart and quit. hopefully before it was too late. All right, but exposure to things like valley air, tobacco smoke, yes, there's a correlation. I didn't say smoking caused death, but sure seems to be a major correlation there. But exposure to the stuff found in tobacco smoke and in valley air can cause chronic pulmonary disease, which means emphysema, which means it's almost impossible to breathe. Your alveoli rupture, basically. They stretch out and rupture, and pulmonary fibrosis, buildup of scar tissue, and it's not a good way to die. That's all I'm saying. All right, breathing is ventilation of the lungs. Breathing has inhalation and exhalation. With every breath you take and inhale, exhale, that keeps the oxygen concentration high inside the lungs and the CO2 low. And that promotes the oxygen going into the blood and the carbon dioxide leaving the blood. All right. All right. In the relaxed state, when you're not breathing, when you're for the second or two, when the lungs are relaxed and not doing anything, the human diaphragm is domed upward towards a heart. And when the diaphragm contracts, it pushes down on the intestines and forces the abdominal region outward. And thus, it could be harder to breathe after you've had a full meal. All right, so when you inhale, the ribs move upward and out as the intercostals, muscles between the ribs, contracts. Same time the diaphragm contracts and moves downward. What does this do? It expands the volume of the thoracic cavity, and that causes a decrease in pressure inside the lungs to a decrease. By increasing the thoracic cavity, you decrease the air pressure below atmospheric pressure outside the lungs. So the air pushes its way in. This is called negative pressure breathing. And the intercostals contract, the diaphragm contracts. Thoracic cavity expands. Air pushes in because air pressure is lower inside than outside the body. When you exhale, the rib muscles relax, diaphragm relaxes, compresses, reduces the volume of the chest cavity. As a consequence, air pressure increases to where it's greater inside the lungs than outside the body, so the air moves out. Reverse of how it came in. So, exhalation increases the pressure and pushes the air out. And this comes about, the rib muscles and diaphragm relax, reducing the thoracic cavity volume. Lungs return to their relaxed position. And the increase in air pressure pushes the air out. Now, the amount of air breathed during maximal, you inhale as much as you can and exhale everything you can. It can be measured by a machine called a spirometer. And this volume is called vital capacity. Now, when you exhale, there's still some dead air that remains. You don't push it all out. Now, as you get older, the lungs lose their elasticity, or because emphysema and pulmonary obstructive chronic disease, it gets harder to breathe. And what happens, less air gets pushed out, means your residual volume increases. That's the volume of dead air at the expense of, and vital capacity is reduced. All right, breathing is under control of your autonomic nervous system. There's respiratory centers in your brain. There is a breathing control center. It measures concentration of CO2 in the blood. When CO2 level increases, there's a buildup of acid causing a drop in pH, and that signals to the brain, and the brain sends a signal to increase the rate and the depth of breathing, the amount of air you take in. All right. In the medulla, that's the part of the brain where this respiratory control center is. It receives the hypothalamus actually measures it. It sends a message. The medulla is directly connected to the lungs. It sends a message, triggers the contraction of the rib muscles and diaphragm. All right, the breathing control. All right, so we increase our number and depth of respirations. There are sensors connected to in the heart, in the aorta, and also in these two blood vessels, the carotids. The common at the base junction of the common carotid meets with the internal and external carotids. That's up in your neck and your head. All right. Transport of gases. Well, the heart pumps blood to two regions. The right side of the heart pumps the oxygen poor blood to the heart, to the lungs, and then back to the heart. And then the left side of the heart pumps the oxygen-rich blood to the rest of the body and back. So in the lungs, basically, the blood gains its oxygen and gets rid of its CO2. But in the other circuit, body tissues, the blood will lose its oxygen and gain the CO2. So, in the lungs, CO2 diffuses out, oxygen diffuses in. Then oxygen-rich blood is pumped to the rest of the body. In the body tissues, oxygen goes to the cells and carbon dioxide comes back to the blood. Then to the right side of the heart, then to the lungs, gas exchange here, back to the heart, and gas exchange here. Now, a mixture of gases, such as air, exerts pressure, and air pressure at sea level is about 14.7 pounds per square inch. And each gas contributes its own partial pressure, and the sum of the partial pressures adds up to the 14.7 pounds per square inch, with nitrogen, by the way, contributing more of the punch than oxygen. Well, there's more nitrogen than oxygen. That explains it. So each gas has its own partial pressure, and gases diffuse down their partial pressure gradient. They go from a gradient from where there's a higher partial pressure of them to where there's a lower partial pressure of them. All right, let's take a look at this. Maybe this will make it sense.
Oxygen-poor blood carrying carbon dioxide leaves the tissue capillaries and moves through blood vessels to the heart, where it is pumped to the alveolar capillaries of the lungs. When blood gets to the lungs, hemoglobin gives up its carbon dioxide and hydrogen ions. Bicarbonate combines with hydrogen ions to form carbonic acid, which is then converted back into carbon dioxide and water. Carbon dioxide diffuses out of the cell, out of the blood plasma, and into an alveolus in the lungs, where it is expelled with exhaled air. Let's start by looking at the movement of respiratory gases between blood and the body's tissue cells. Oxygen molecules are unloaded from hemoglobin, a protein in red blood cells. Oxygen diffuses into the blood plasma, through the capillary wall, into the interstitial fluid, and into cells, where it is used in cellular respiration. Meanwhile, oxygen from inhaled air diffuses out of the alveolus into the blood plasma and into the red blood cell, where it combines with hemoglobin. Oxygen-rich blood then leaves the alveolar capillaries and travels to the heart, where it is pumped through blood vessels to tissue capillaries. There, red blood cells deliver oxygen to tissue cells.
All right. Now, most animals have respiratory pigments, like hemoglobin, for example. Mollusks and arthropods have a copper-containing pigment. Remember Mr. Spock in Star Trek? He had green blood because his he didn't have iron in his corpuscles. It was copper. Well, that's science fiction. But anyway. So, red iron, hemoglobin is found in vertebrates, and also some invertebrates, like certain insects, have red blood. Now, hemoglobin transports both oxygen and some CO2. The majority of the CO2 is actually carried in the blood plasma, but some of it is carried by the hemoglobin in the red blood cells. All right, and yes, hemoglobin helps to buffer the blood by tying up excess hydrogen, keep the pH constant in the blood. All right, now, carbon dioxide dissolved in water forms carbonic acid. Carbonic acid will dissociate to form hydrogen ion and bicarbonate ion. With a buildup of hydrogen ion, that signals a drop in pH. Therefore, that will also, and depending on the amount of carbon dioxide you have in the blood, will in turn determine the level of hydrogen ion. Bicarbonate can accept hydrogen ions, so bicarbonate can also act as a buffer too. Alright, each of your red blood cells has about 250 million hemoglobin, and each hemoglobin can tie up 4 oxygen molecules. Alright, so a hemoglobin molecule is 4 polypeptide chains, and attached to each polypeptide is a heme group. The heme group contains iron, and iron is what binds the oxygen. Now, a human fetus in the womb does not breathe with its lungs. The lungs are not functioning while the baby's in the womb. Exchange of gases takes place with the placenta between the fetal circulation and the maternal circulation. Now, fetal hemoglobin ties up oxygen, has a stronger affinity than adult hemoglobin. And yes, so the baby will take oxygen directly from the mother's blood. Now, mothers that smoke are cutting down on the oxygen available to the baby and increasing carbon monoxide. And interesting, hemoglobin will take up carbon monoxide more readily than it will oxygen. So that's a good way to kill your baby. Smoke during your pregnancy. There has been more than one stillbirth on account that the mother smoked heavily during her pregnancy. Just stating a fact. Now, under normal conditions, at birth, the baby takes its first breath due to an increase in carbon dioxide no longer attached to the placenta. And then the brain kicks in and baby starts breathing on its own.